Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
René de Ceccatty, a writer, a biographer, playwright, and a translator. René de Ceccatty has given most of his attention to Italian and Japanese writers. He has translated works of Giacomo Leopardi, Pierpaolo Pasolini, Alberto Moravia, and has written biographies of Pierpaolo Pasolini, Alberto Moravia, Elsa Morante recently, and also a novel called Noir Souci. I mean, I don't know if it's really a novel or récit, which is a kind of essay, biography about the last days of Giacomo Leopardi in Naples and his friend Ranieri. So you have handled writers and poets of the utmost importance in Italy, right? Now, why Japan and Italy became so important in your life as you are a French writer?
It's different for Italy and Japan. It was really by chance because I was sent to Japan when I was 25, because it was the habit in France to send young students in foreign countries instead of making a military service. So I was sent to Japan and I learned Japanese and was fascinated by Japan and above all Japanese literature. And it stayed very important in my life, in my private life and in my intellectual life. But for Italy, it was very different because I grew up when I was a child in Tunisia. And in Tunisia, I have a young lady who were in my family, and she was from Sicily. And I stayed alone with her, and she speak to me in Italian. So Italian language was very familiar to me from the beginning. And when I was a teenager, I found out the books and the films, the movies by Pasolini, and Pasolini was very important for me when I was 15 years old, and it stayed very important for me. So when I was older, I began to translate Italian works, and I went very often into Italy. And so Italy became another country for me, home country for me, like Japan, but more Italy, of course.
Pierpaolo Pasolini is a very interesting link between Alberto Moravia and his wife Elsa Morante, right? Because he was friend of Alberto Moravia and for some time also very close to Elsa Morante. Is it because of Pasolini that you decided, because you wrote a biography of Pasolini, that you decided to write one of Alberto Moravia and one of Elsa Morante?
Yes, you're right. The starting point was Pasolini's, because when I began to read Italian, I read Pasolini and Moravia, because Moravia has a very simple language and it's very important for foreigners to read Italian reading Moravia. So I was familiar with Moravia. And I must say, when the first time I was asked to translate Moravia, I hesitated. But the main reason was his friendship with Pasolini. And when I met for the first time Moravia, we spoke a lot about Pasolini and about his wife, about Elsa Morante. And it was very important for me to understand the importance of the friendship for Moravia. And afterwards, I translated more novels and more short stories written by Moravia. And the friendship from Moravia to Elsa Morante and Pasolini was very important and remained the main thing. So it was important for me to understand what was different in Moravia and Pasolini's works and Elsa Morante's works, and what really was a link between them. So when I wrote about Moravia and when I wrote about Elsa Morante, I had always in my thoughts the presence of Moravia and of Pasolini. So, for instance, in my biography of Moravia, I speak and write a lot about Pasolini. And in my biography about Elsa Morante, I write a lot about Moravia, but also about Pasolini. So the trio was very important.
You say there was a link between these three very important writers. What is the link? What did they have in common, these three very different writers? Because they were ultimately different, right?
Of course. The three of them had the idea of poetry, of being a poet. Just one was really a poet, Pasolini, of course. But even in Moravia, I've recently translated Moravia's poetry into French. It will be published next month. And I think it's very important to understand the friendship between Moravia and Pasolini. It's very important to understand that he was fascinated by the poets and he wanted to be a poet. So I think it's very important. And even for Elsa Morante. Elsa Morante has published her first collection of poetry in the collection which was published in Longanesi, and the director of the collection was Nico Naldini, Pasolini's cousin. And Elsa Morante published her first poetry collection in this collection at Longanesi, and at the same time, Pasolini published L'Usignolo della Chiesa Cattolica. Between Moravia and Pasolini, there was something more. That was the need to understand their country, Italy. Not only Italy, but the people of Italy. And I think that between them, this kind of deep need to understand people and politics. So probably the friendship between Pasolini and Moravia was very intellectual and rational. But between Elsa Morante and Pasolini, there was something else. Elsa Morante was fascinated by gay men, by homosexuals. And they fell in love. She fell in love with Visconti. And when she met Pasolini, it was in 54, 55, during the Christmas and the beginning of the year in 55, had just left Visconti. And it was very important for her to meet another gay creator. I think it was very important for her. But there were other deep links between them. And even if during the time they had a real quarrel, very important about the story, La Storia, because Pasolini didn't like it.
La Storia was not the masterpiece of Elsa Morante, but was the most popular novel, right? I mean, it was a big novel. It became a bestseller, a case, yes. Right? Books, Isola d'Arturo, Lo Scialle Andaluso.
Il mondo salvato dai ragazzini. Anche.
La Storia made her this very popular writer, right? And
yes,
Pasolini didn't like the novel, criticized the novel.
He didn't like the novel because he thought that La Storia was a less good novel, but also because she spoke about the Roman people, and he thought that the Roman people belonged to him. So he was the writer of Roman people, Pasolini. When I say people, I speak about the poor people, of course. That's one of the reasons, and probably he thought, like other critics, that Elsa Morante didn't understand very well the story. So the struggle of poor people during the war. He thought that Elsa Morante idealized Ida, il suo person, her character. So that's another reason. And the use of the language. He didn't like the use of language in La Storia because, according to him, Elsa Morante invented a language which was not the right language of poor people. So it was very severe critic. And they split after the publication of the book, and she didn't speak with him anymore.
Let's go back to these two other writers. The only one of these that you knew well was Alberto Moravia, because you met him many times, you were close, so you knew him probably much better, right, than you did Pasolini. And when you wrote these two biographies, first Alberto Moravia and Elsa Morante, you wrote the two books. Elsa Morante and Alberto Moravia are like a big thing together, right? Because they had a lot of fights. I mean, Elsa was a very important figure in Moravia's life, and Alberto was a very important figure in Elsa's life, because they were writers, and also because they were married, and also because they had this strange destiny that she had a Jewish mother and he had a Jewish father. And as you described well in Elsa Morante's biography, they wanted to make this big marriage, Catholic marriage, this famous priest, Padre Tacchi Ventura, no? Who was also a friend of Mussolini, because they wanted to show that they were not Jewish in a time where Jews were persecuted in Italy, no? In the fall, under the fascist regime during the war. So they had many links, right? And also you speak about La Storia, but Alberto Moravia wrote La Ciociara, and he talks also like he does about this strange moment when they had to hide near Fondi in very uncomfortable and difficult life in order to escape the persecutions. The bound between Moravia and Morante in the bad and the good is very, very strong, right? You manage to tell two stories.
The period more important in their lives when they had to hide in, as you said, in Fondi, because during the war, Moravia found out that Elsa Morante was a very, very courageous person, and she was writing Menzogna in Sortileggio during the war. So she was very busy, and she could not write this book because they were in too hard conditions in Fondi. And I think that when he was writing La Ciociara, he wanted to write a real homage to his wife, because the personage, the main character of the novel, according to me, is kind of Elsa Morante. So for him, it was very important. And I think that until his death, Moravia has admired his wife as a person and as a writer. As a writer, he wrote a lot about her. So there is no doubt about the admiration of Moravia for his wife. But even as a person, and he has difficulties to bear the character and the bad temper of his wife, but there was something more deep that let him admire Elsa Morante. But they had very different ways of writing. So for him, it was very important to be very clear, to understand rationally all the words. But for Elsa Morante, the main thing was to very obscure thing inside the word. So she wanted to understand something very, very black and dark in her and in the world. But for Moravia, it was very different, because he wanted absolutely to make the readers understand clearly the world. So we couldn't imagine two more different personalities.
But Elsa Morante, even if she was constantly quarreling with Alberto and also having difficult relationship, she admired him quite a lot.
Yes, of course, because she needed him. She never wanted to divorce. And it was not only because she was Catholic and believed in the eternity of love with marriage, but even she needed this kind of person because she knew that Alberto Moravia was a person very honest, intellectually, absolutely honest. And it was very important for her to have this kind of solid person, strong person. She knew that he had weaknesses, but she could bear the weaknesses, all this sentimental life, which was very difficult to follow. But she needed to have him really near her. So it was contradictory in Elsa Morante, because she could be very hard with him when she was speaking about him, but she didn't imagine her life without him.
The big struggle of Alberto Moravia was the fact that he was ill. He had a terrible childhood, right? He had tuberculosis of the bones. He didn't go to school. He was suffering. And therefore, his first novel, The Time of Indifference, Gli Indifferenti, was kind of a relief for him to write that, right? It comes out of your book. He wrote it when he was 17 years old, and he maybe unconsciously wrote a masterpiece, right? A book that became very famous and important. And therefore, when he meets Elsa, he is already a very famous, well-known international writer. Elsa has to struggle to become an equally, or at least a very important writer herself.
Yes, of course, but she was also very precocious. She has written her first short stories when she was very young, at 15. So both of them were very clever and intelligent young writers. But of course, she was not well known. So it was for her very, very hard to live with a very, very well-known writer. And she had to wait after the war, so in 1947-48, to become famous. And it was with the help of her husband that it was rather humiliating. And she had to struggle against this humiliation. She didn't want to be called Mrs. Moravia, and often she was called Mrs. Moravia. So you're right to use the word struggle. She had to struggle to become Elsa Morante. And she got success because when Menzonia e Sortilegio was published, Lukács, the great literary critic, said that it was the most important novel of the 20th century. So I think she knew that she was acknowledged as a great writer, and she became very proud. And probably that was another problem of Elsa Morante, because she was very proud and she felt humiliated. And I think during all her life, the two contrary powers in her, an immense pride and the feeling of humiliation. She felt attracted by very humble people. That's one of the reasons, because she felt so attracted by humble people in La Storia, but in other novels as well.
At the same time, reading your books, it comes out this quite strange paradox. Alberto Moravia, he was ill, he was sick, but he was born in a well-off bourgeois family, right? Yeah. His father was a successful architect, his mother was an aristocrat, and his whole life, he criticized all the time the bourgeoisie, right? He always sort of against this origin of his. On the contrary, Elsa Morante comes from a very poor and very uncertain background because she didn't know was her father really. Her mother was a poor school teacher. I mean, when she meets Moravia, she's a very, very poor young person, right? And he is a bourgeois, not only a writer, but also a comfortable man. I don't say wealthy, rich, but very comfortable. So they are both attracted also by that because she is close to the poor people in her writings, but she's also attracted by Visconti. She's attracted by Moravia. She's very often attracted by people who are wealthy, who are in upper class situation, right? In other words, Elsa despised Moravia, bourgeois, whatever, but at the same time she was attracted.
Yes, but she was attracted not only by wealth, by the fact that he was well off. Now, I think that she was attracted by the sense of criticism which was in Moravia. So what was important for her, that Moravia was, okay, a bourgeois, but a bourgeois who was very conscious of his bourgeoisie and who struggled against bourgeoisie in his first novels. So, L'ambizione sbagliata e gli indifferenti. That was the main thing for her. So she was fascinated by the money or the social rank, but by the intelligence of Moravia and his capacity to criticize his origin, because it would be impossible for her to be with just a man who would allow her to be very rich and with a place in social world. So she wanted to have a high society. She wanted to have a man who would be the more important critic of his own origin. That was the thing. So it's not contradictory. The fact that she was attracted by Moravia, who was a bourgeois, it's not important because the main thing is that it was a very clever, intelligent bourgeois who was conscious of all the main defaults of his bourgeoisie. Even in her novels, Elsa Morante wanted to represent the same problem, for instance, in Menzogna e Sortileggio. In Menzogna e Sortileggio, but in her novel, all the different classes of the society are represented. So the poor and the rich and the aristocrats and the very unknown people. And so it was important for her to have a vision of all the society. But as you know, Moravia was very interested in very poor people because his main success was the Racconti Romani. The Racconti Romani speak about all the different parts of the society.
Tell me something, René, your experience. How was it for you as a writer to have to handle these two lives? I mean, how did you write these two books?
It was very different because for Moravia, it was a hard work, but it was simpler for me because I wanted to describe all the world, not only a life, but a world. And a life, I have a great help in your book because when you wrote the book with Moravia, Vita di Moravia, it was the first time that Moravia not gave an interview, but gave a so deep interview. And you helped him to have a memory of his past. And as you know, he hated the past. But you helped him to tell us all his story with many, many details. It's something absolutely exceptional. So I had this material who was very important because it was the first source. But I wanted not only to describe his life, but to understand all his relationships with other people and all with the story. But for Elsa Morante, it was different because I was embarrassed because I felt that Elsa Morante didn't want to have somebody who would tell her story. So I had not to be too invasive in the description of her life, and she was more secret. Because Moravia was not a secret man. He wanted to express all his opinions, and he was very direct when he spoke with other people. And for him, it was very simple to speak with other people. But for Elsa, it was very different, because she wanted to hide many, many parts of her life. And that was the great difficulty for me, to understand till what point I could go to describe what she didn't want to be told. So I could have not written when she was alive. It would be impossible, because she would have killed me if she had known that I was writing a biography. So when I was writing about Moravia, I felt secured, and I didn't have reticence. So when I was writing about her, I felt very ill at ease, because I felt that it was not fair to write about her. I had a kind of guilt.
But at the end of the day, as you have now published Elsa Morante, now in Italy and before in Paris, and Alberto Moravia, as their lives are so close and so interconnected, two biographies together make one book?
I don't think so. It couldn't be just one book, because the method I used was very different in the books. Because I wanted, when I was writing about Moravia, to write a kind of book about a century. For Elsa Morante, is just a portrait of a writer, very, very secret. And I know that it couldn't be the truth of Elsa Morante. I don't want to say that my book is the truth about Alberto Moravia, but a kind of truth. But for her, I know that something which is very important for her doesn't appear in my book. It's a very strange feeling.
What's the difference for you between writing novel or fiction work or to write a biography? Why are you so, as a novelist, you are so attracted by writing biographies?
Because even in my fiction books or in my own books, when I speak about myself, I want to seek the truth. I want to catch the truth. And I think that it's very important to write biographies, to understand oneself, to understand myself. I need to write about other people whom I admire. Hector Bianciotti, whom you knew, told that to write his autobiography, he wrote his autobiography, he needed to have written novels before. But I would say that to write novels, it's necessary to have written biographies. Because to build characters, fiction characters, you have to know how a real person is built. And above all, the writers, because writers want to build an image of themselves.
You are also a theater writer, right? You worked for the theater, worked with actors, many actresses, famous actresses. Who were the actresses? Adriana Asti,
Claudia Cardinale.
What an actor becomes a character, right? Play, for instance, or a biographer becomes also a character. You are a kind of an actor when you write a book about
yes, of course.
Alberto.
No, I like very much the theater for this reason, because I don't need only to write playwrights, but I need to go to the theater, to the rehearsals, and to be between actors, because it's very important. I must say that one of my main experiences was when I was working with Isabella Gianni, and she was playing my play adapted from La Dame aux Camélias. And every night, every show, I was under the scene because there was an underground, and she was playing on my head. And it was an experience very deep, not only an experience of a playwright, but to understand what succeeds, what happens during a show. So the theater and the writing, not the theater and the novel, but writing and to be in a theater is very, very similar. As you said, it's the building of a character, not only my character or myself, but the creation of a world of imagination. And the strange thing is that Elsa Morante didn't like theater. She said to Adriana Asti, what an horror. Theater is an horrible thing. But she was fascinated at the end of her life by the actors. Her last real friends were actors.
But in the same time, Alberto Moravia conceived his novels somehow like, Gli Indifferenti is a bit like a play.
Yes, he was right. The first thing he told me when we met was, I say it in Italian, io non sono un romanziere, io sono un drammaturgo travestito in narratore. He was right.
At the end of the day, these two main writers of the 20th century, what is your feeling about these two writers?
I think that Moravia is the greatest novelist in Italy. And I declared it many times, and the people who listened to me was shocked. But I think that really is the only great novelist in Italy, because he used novels to say something he couldn't say otherwise. The most important things he had to say was said in his novels. And that's the definition of a great novelist. But for Elsa Morante, I do not think that Elsa Morante is a great novelist. I think she's a great writer, of course, and a great poet, but not really a great novelist, because she had many things to say otherwise in poetry, and even in her text like Pro o Contra la bomba atomica. She had many ways to express her world. But Moravia, even if he wrote articles and many diaries, traveling diaries, etc., but the most important things are in his novel. And that's the reason for what I like very much, for instance, La Noia e la Ciociara. There are novels which tells a lot about him.
So, René, are you going to write other biographies? Or now you will only concentrate on your own novels?
No, I don't know if I will, because these three writers have a special place. I have difficulties to find another kind of writer. Next, it will be my biography, because I wrote another biography, a biography of Sibilla Leramo, and it will be republished, reprinted in Italian, because it has been already translated and was published 20 years ago by Mondadori. Another little small publisher will publish it at the end of the year.
After you dealt with Moravia, with Pasolini, with Elsa Morante, what do you think of contemporary Italian literature? Are you still following it or not?
More or less, but sometimes I'm asked to translate young writers. I must say, for instance, recently I was asked to translate Nicola La Gioia. I didn't want to translate him because I need to have a real and deep relationship with the text, with the writer. And even if he writes interesting novels, but they do not fit with my feelings, my deeper feelings. And I will translate, for instance, not a young writer, but a very important writer, according to me, who is Edith Bruck, which is Hungarian, but she wrote marvelous novels about when she was deported, she was Jewish. And I will translate her next novel. I need really, and I told you that I like very much your book, your last book. You know, I'm not a critic.
Okay.
It is important for me to have deep and true relationship with the text, not with the person, but with the text. The responsibility of a translator is very important because you can destroy a book translating it.
So this translating is again another activity of yours. You are novelist, biographer, theater man. There was a famous Italian publisher called Giulio Einaudi, who had invented una collana, a series of books, writers translated by writers. And
But
he always asked to me also to translate something, and I never wanted to do it. But why do you like to translate?
It's the same thing as to write biographies, because I want to understand how a writer writes, how a writer thinks. For instance, when I was translating Moravia, it was very important because Moravia was very different from me, very, very different in many, many ways. But I wanted to understand what his way of intelligence. He had an intelligence very clear, and I must say that translating Moravia, I understood him. And when I was only reading him, I didn't understand him completely.
Did you also translate Elsa Morante?
No, apart from the different quotes in my novel, because I translated all the part of, even if it was already translated into French, I made again the translation to have a more unified style. But for instance, recently I translated La Divina Commedia, Dante, because I wanted to understand it. I really translated Dante to understand Dante. I think that is very important, and even for a writer, it's very important to go out of his own language. For you, it's different because you use 3 languages in your life, Italian, French, and English. I use very often Italian now because I've many Italian friends. But it's important to have a relationship with the literature written in other languages.
It is very important to underline that it is the 700th anniversary of Dante this year. Dante's year all over the world. I imagine that your translation of Dante is a very important document in this celebration, in this event. There will be a lot of speaking about Dante in 2021.
Yes, because Carlo Solami asked me to take part, to belong to the Comitato del settimo centenario della morte di Dante. Quindi, yes, I'm conscious of it. But my translation was published 2 years ago, and I've made a translation very easy to understand. I didn't want to make notes and to help the reader to understand. I wanted that my translation could be read very, very easily, because I wanted to help the reader in French to have the pleasure of reading, not the feeling to become intelligent and to understand the story of the 14th century in Italy, but to have just the pleasure of reading the story. it has been criticized by the academic researchers, but I think that it has been a pleasure for some readers.
So what are you doing now?
Now I am translating from Japanese because during 30 years I've translated Japanese with a Japanese friend, and this Japanese friend now is in Japan. He left France and he lives in Japan. So I have to translate by myself. So during the lockdown, already a year ago, I was, as anybody, I was forced to stay at home. And I used the time to try and translate already a novel written by Soseki, who is a writer of the beginning of the 20th century. And I'm translating a novel called Snow Country by Kawabata. And for the same reason, because I want to understand how a writer very different from me works. And for Japanese, I forced myself to write the text in Japanese before every sentence, before translating it.
Alain Elkann interviews.